Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Niall Stewart and welcome to my talk for the Kinsale Arts Weekend 2020. The subject is A History of the Courcys of Kinsale, Barnes, Kingsale. Now, you'll hear me saying Kingsale a lot throughout this talk. That is one of the oldest spellings of the town's name, and the noble title of the de Courcys uses it. Also, I've called the talk A History, not The History. That's because there is ample scope to create the history of the family, but it would take several lectures, involve much archival work in England and America, and also the tracking down of manuscripts in private holding. The early period of the family in Ireland is confused, and there are several areas of obscurity. This has created uncertainty over just how many Barons Kinsale there have been. On the death of John, Baron Kinsale, in 2005, he was reckoned either the 28th, 30th, or 35th Baron. He thought he was the 35th. I have adopted his numbering and that of the historian John Lodge. Also, due to time constraints, this will be a themed history of the family, and I will not contextualise it by reference to academic texts. My general focus will be on the family and its relationship with the Kinsale area. I've divided the talk into sections, and you may wish to pause between these for a cup of tea, a definite improvement on a physical lecture. I will discuss the following: the family's origin, their earlier years in Ireland, an examination of their landholdings, their Irish landholdings, their loyalties and religion, the famous hat privilege, and their residences. If you have questions or comments, then please feel free to post them up and I'll answer them when I see them. If you prefer, then you can send me a message. Also, should anyone have any old documents about the de Courcys or indeed about the Kinsale area, then please contact me. Section 1. Origins. The family traces these back 1300 years to the 8th century, to Charlemagne, Charles the Great, founder of the Carolingian Empire. Through his descendants, the kings of France, and their relations, the Dukes of Lorraine, we find the line in the person of Balderic the Teuton, coming to Normandy in the 10th century to serve the Dukes of Normandy. Balderic's son, Robert, became the Lord of Courcy-sur-Dive in Normandy, dying in 1061. He took his surname from this place. He became Robert of Courcy. His son Richard, and I should say they're all de Courcys from now on, his son went to England in the Norman conquest of 1066. For his part in the conquest, he was granted several estates in England, including that of Stoke in Somerset. The place took his name and was known as Stoke Courcy, the name becoming corrupted over the centuries to Stoke-Courcy. They become established there, and it is Robert's grandson Sir John who takes the family to Ireland. Sir John de Courcy, remembered as the Lord of Ulster, arrived in Ireland in 1177 and went on to conquer a portion of the north. The story of his life is famous enough to be easily accessible, and I will not dwell on it here. However, it is his legacy that connects him to Kinsale. The hat privilege, which I will refer to later, comes from him. Sir John died in 1219 in France, his lands and title having been taken from him as a result of political intrigues by the de Lacy family. Authorities differ on whether he had any children or not, but the de Courcys of Kinsale certainly took him as their ancestor, and other sources seem to suggest that he did have children. Miles, either his son or grandson, establishes the link with Kinsale. Section 2. The Kinsale area and the de Courcys. The said Miles de Courcy received a grant of the title of Kingsale and Ringroan from King Henry III on the 29th of May 1223, and so became the first Baron Kinsale. This grant ended his claim to Ulster and also to Stoke Courcy. He, being obliged to reside in Ireland, did not claim this manor. Miles died in 1230. His son Patrick, the second Baron, made a fortunate marriage to the daughter of Milo de Cogan. Now de Cogan was one of the original Norman conquerors of Cork and was granted the kingdom of Cork, excluding the city. He had no sons, and so his estate was divided between his daughters. The evidence is suggestive that Miles de Courcy was one of the knights who helped de Cogan conquer Cork. Landless knights like Miles would have been drawn to the opportunities of the frontiers of the ongoing conquest, and thus an advantageous match would have been made for his companion's son. This would also explain the father's title matching the lands that his son gained by that marriage. Patrick is sufficiently important to be included in government business at Westminster and paying money towards the King's War in France. This Patrick provides us with one of the Irish names of the old head, Dunmacpatrick, meaning stronghold of the son of Patrick. The invaders advanced west until the Irish resurgence of the 1260s. The Anglo-Normans had pushed through Cork and were busy conquering Kerry when they were beaten at the Battle of Callan near Kilgarvan in August 1261. The Irish, under Fernand McCarthy, pushed back the invaders until they came as far as Ringrone in 1262, where they were defeated by Milo de Courcy, many of the Irish being said to have drowned in the River Bandon and Fernand himself being killed. This is the first exchange between the McCarthy Rays, that's the Carbery branch, and the de Courcys. However, there is a historical problem with this story. There seeming to have been no Milo de Courcy in 1262, but that's for a deeper discussion. Patrick's son, Nicholas, the third Baron, barely survives in the historical records. Nicholas's son Edmund, the fourth Baron, died without children, probably as a young adult, and was succeeded by his brother John, the fifth Baron. John was a minor in the 1290s, and the Crown administered his estate, including lands in Kerry that I am still trying to identify. He came of age, that's about 15, around the mid-1290s, and was killed in 1302 when the family next clashed with the McCarthy Rays. John was killed, along with his brother Patrick, in battle at Inchydoney in 1302 whilst fighting these McCarthy Rays. This must have been a raid or invasion, as the area around Clonakilty was never de Courcy land, and this is a good moment to talk about the original extent of the Courcy estate. In 1301, the de Courcys are listed as having the civil parishes of Ringrone, Kilbrittain, Kilrone, Balnadee, Temple Trine, Rathclaren, and across the River Bandon to Sasson, Lamini, and Kinsale. Those 9 parishes add up to 40,323 acres. That's about 2% of the entire county. This would have been the estate at its largest, going from the edge of Timoleague to the edge of Balgooly. So that's about 13.5 miles wide from its most westerly to its most easterly points, and from its southern tip at the Old Head to the northern extremity, Collier's Quay, near Shiphole, that's about 11.5 miles. To illustrate its irregular shape, I have put it on an accompanying map. However, it can be viewed more exactly using the townlands.ie website, where the individual civil parishes are shown. Dundero parish was likely part of the estate, wedged as it is between Lamini and Tissasson, but the documentary evidence does not seem to mention it. I am still working on that, so I have not included it in the total of the estate. I am also trying to locate the lands that the family had in Kerry at places called Acomkerry, Bleonry, Glenardle and Finwath. These are all around the year 1300. How they got these lands, where they were, when they were lost, is all still a mystery to me for the moment, but I am of course still working on it. Section 3. Lands and Money, 1300s onwards. The 1300s were a period of disaster for the English colony in Ireland. A series of bad harvests resulted in famine, there was a Scottish invasion, and then the Black Death plague. All these combined to undermine the colony. There are few indications of what was happening exactly in the Kinsale area at this time, but the first marriage of a de Courcy into the native chiefs by Miles, the 7th Baron, who married an O'Brien, plus the erection of Kinsale's town wall in the 1380s suggests that the colony in this area was adapting to a defensive position. The 1400s seem to confirm this, as they seem to have been a period of on-off warfare between the McCarthy Rays and the de Courcys. This of course ties into the continuing collapse of English authority over much of Ireland in the later Middle Ages. With Kinsale as an anchor, there was still a centre of English command, albeit a weak peripheral port, so the de Courcys did not turn into an old English version of the Irish, as so many of the descendants of the Anglo-Norman lords did elsewhere in Ireland. With the resurgence of the McCarthy Rays, the first castle to fall was Kilbrittain, close to the western border of the estate, sometime between 1406 and 1414. In the 1440s, we have the de Courcys retaking Kilbrittain Castle and then being driven out a short time later in 1449. The McCarthys hold it from then until 1462, when the de Courcys took advantage of a McCarthy family feud and reoccupied it, holding on to it apparently until around 1510 when they lost it forever. So, this shows that the western border of the estate was in flux for much of the 1400s. The expenditure of warfare and the inevitable impact onto agricultural income would have been substantial on the family's resources. It has also been suggested that the de Courcys were weakened by their interest in the civil wars in England at the time, taking away their focus, money and men from Ireland. So we see between 1406 and 1510 the McCarthy Rays had conquered the following: all of Kilbrittain, all of Rathclaren, all of Balnadee, half of Templetrine, and a third of Ringroan parishes, amounting to around 25,417 acres taken from their original 40,322 acre estate. With the loss of over half of their estate, we then start to find mortgages and sales of portions of their surviving estate from the 1500s. However, it is very likely that this process started earlier and that the records have simply not survived. It seems that they first started disposing of their estate east of the River Bandon. Most of these deals involved the old English merchants of Kinsale. Labourley parish passed to the Roaches, to Sasson to the Mees, Galways and Roaches, the three most important families in medieval Kinsale. I should note that this is part of a common trend at the time, where merchants bought land to become part of the landowning gentry. They also married into them, bringing money with them. Kinsale parish seems to have passed out of the de Courcy family at a very early stage, only a portion seeming to remain in the family by 1391, and their castle and town, which I shall mention later. Their pre-1500 sales seem to amount to around 4,853 acres sold. With the loss of this area as well, the family was left with the following: all of Kilroan parish, one half of Templetrine, and 2/3 of Ringroan. That's around 10,052 acres of their original 40,323 acre grant. It's this portion of the estate that seems to have crystallised as the area now known as Courcy's country. Take a look at the sign out at Barrels Cross. With the conquest and sale of these areas, the family ran into financial difficulties. Indeed, this impoverished aspect of the de Courcys became one of their defining features from the 1580s until apparently recently. Gerald, the 17th Baron, who was Baron from 1535 until 1599, accelerated the relative impoverishment of the family by his participation in Henry VIII's wars in France in the 1540s. From the 1550s until his death, we find him selling or mortgaging his patrimony. By 1583, he had disposed of the remainder of his landed estate. One source describes him as selling all his estate for wine, but I presume that this is wine as an investment and not for personal indulgence. A Crown examination of 1587 shows that most of his lands had been sold to the McCarthy Rays, the remainder being sold off to the old English merchants in Kinsale. And, but for a quirk of history, this would have been the end of the Kingsale estate. That quirk was the siege and battle of Kinsale in 1601. John, 18th Baron, had taken the side of the New English and had not been drawn into rebellion. I imagine that the Desmond Rebellion, still in living memory, and the confiscatory aftermath of that had put the de Courcys off the dangerous path of rebellion. Their loyalty, plus the intention of the Crown to reduce the power of the McCarthy Rays, meant that the de Courcys were given a portion of their estate back, the part that the McCarthys had acquired. The portions bought by the Old English were gone forever. This left the de Courcys with around 3,676 acres that they would possess from the early 1600s until the estate was sold in the early 1900s. That figure does fluctuate slightly, but only slightly. Their estate was left in 5 separated portions. See my accompanying drawn map of the area between Jamesport and Garrettstown. The reduction of the estate to this size, plus the fact that the family would not go into a profitable employment, meant that the family was to be burdened by repetitive mortgages for the remainder of their ownership of the estate. Mortgages, loans and bonds become frequent in the archives from this time on. exacerbated by the large dowries that were meant to go with their daughters upon marriage. The prestige of their title as the oldest English lordship in Ireland meant that prospective sons-in-law expected a handsome fortune to arrive with their bride. In 1602, the said John, 18th Baron, is described as too poor to sustain even the costs of a court case, his estate being defined as the least part of his ancestors' possessions. From 1608, the family acquire a pension from the Crown because, quote, His Majesty took notice of the antiquity of the family, never blemished with any disloyalty, and the services of him and his ancestors to the Crown, in regard of which services, nobility, and loyalty, says the King, and because his estate, being decayed by the change of times, was nothing answerable to the dignity of his birth, he is given a pension. End quote. In 1612, the Baron surrendered what appears to be the last of his rights in the town of Kinsale to the town corporation. In 1620, an inquisition gives the total rental of the estate to be worth £16, 8 shillings and 4pence. Of course, that would have been worth a lot more than it sounds, now. There would, of course, have been other sources of income: fines for new leases, money from Ballinspittle Market, presentation rights to 4 churches, mill tolls, manorial court fees, etc. This would have increased his income. Also, there appear to be several omissions in this 1620 inquisition. For example, Ballinspittle was renting for £1, 6 shillings and 8pence in 1634, Ballinspittle not listed at all in the 1620 list. The Lord's pension is raised to £150 in 1625. Just compare that to the rental of the estate. In the 1630s, he mortgages his castle on Higher O'Connell Street and never gets it back. I will discuss this in the residence section. In 1636, Gerald, son of John, and he is the 19th Baron, converts to Catholicism and so loses his pension of £150. As I say, a serious loss when you compare it to the overall estate rental. In the 1640s, during the Civil War, the Lord Courcy managed to stay out of it, neither taking part in the rebellion nor vigorously supporting the English. He was accused of using the chaos to profit, exorbitantly charging people to shelter their goods in his old head castle. After the civil wars had ended in the 1650s and Cromwell was in power, Patrick, the 20th Baron, was included in the order for the Catholic gentry to be sent to Connaught. He pleaded his innocence and was allowed to stay in Kinsale with his estates intact. In 1663, the £150 pension is restored. The Protestant provision of the earlier one isn't mentioned, and that's probably because Charles II was more amicable towards Catholicism. Almericus becomes 23rd Baron in 1669 as a child and lived until 1719, thus spending 50 years as the Baron Kingsale. I'll speak more about him when I'm discussing religion and loyalty, but the mentions of de Courcy wealth and land are frequent during his life. In 1679, his means are described as a small and encumbered estate. In 1680, his fortune is too small to travel, and his situation described as broken fortunes. To support him, the Crown increased his pension to £300 a year. From 1694 until the 1740s, the family seemed to be involved in an unusually high amount of court cases, very expensive affairs at the time, and mostly involving lawsuits against other family members. In Almericus's will of 1719, he disposed of £11,200, which is an impressive sum for the time. Almericus's English widow, Anne, left £3,470 in her will of 1725. His cousin and his heir, Gerald, the 24th Baron, creates the first of a series of complicated legal devices upon his marriage in 1725 to Margaretta Essington, a rich English heiress, and these were specifically designed by his new father-in-law to protect the estate from over-mortgaging. It was meant to give control of the land to trustees for 100 years. It did not work. 3 years later, in 1728, we find him borrowing money on townlands and his right to present clergy to churches, in this case to present clergy to the then ruined Courtapertine Church. After his wedding in 1725, he seems to have lived in England, and his Irish estate in 1728 was estimated to be worth around £800 a year. In 1737, we find him further defying his father-in-law and completely revoking the marriage settlement deed of 1725, mortgaging out his entire estate to a rich lady in London. After the death of his father-in-law, who actually choked on a grape, he returned to the Kinsale area. In 1745, we find Gerald being feasted by the Kinsale Corporation, the town council, who present him with 192 bottles of wine and punch, cider, and beer in unknown quantities. The family pension, still being passed from baron to baron, was still £300 in 1748. Despite this, in the same year, we find Gerald mortgaging the whole estate to Henry Tom of Kinsale for £600. This particular mortgage would be quite problematic for the family and would continue into the early 1800s. In one of the very few surviving letters of the family, we have one of Gerald's daughters writing from the Old Head Manor House in 1751, estimating her dowry at between £5,000 and £6,000. At the time, we can estimate the baron's income would have been roughly £1,100 a year. Her dowry may be in part value of the English estates of the Essingtons, which Gerald left between his daughters. Having given the English estates to his daughters, and despite having a healthy account with bankers Kane and Latouche of Dublin, he found himself embarrassed by his debts and was unable to pay them in 1754. To resolve this, his intention was to leave his resources to trustees to pay off the debts. However, it appears that he went insane before this occurred. The alleged insanity of Gerald created a drama that lasted for a decade and needs some background. At some stage in the early 1600s, a branch of the family emigrated to America, settling in Maryland, England's Catholic-friendly colony in the New World. In the 1650s, Henry de Courcy acquires an estate there and prospers. They settle down into the landed gentry of America, and they only re-emerge in our story 100 years later, in 1759. Gerald died in 1759 without sons, so there was a lack of male heirs to inherit the title, and so there was a search to find the nearest male heir. The American branch provided not one, but two, William de Courcy and John de Courcy. The daughters of Gerald supported William, but he does not seem to have been assertive in his possible right to the barony. The other claimant was John de Courcy, who was working as a sailor in Portsmouth. The controversial point was the identity of John of Portsmouth. The daughters claimed that he was a fraud created by Francis Carney of Garrettstown. They alleged that Carney had produced this impostor, and once the barony was settled on him, that he would sell the estate to Carney. In addition to this, the daughters alleged that their father had been insane for several years, and that Carney had had him locked up in a house in Kinsale, brainwashing the baron into accepting John as his heir. After Gerald's death, the said John moved into the manor house at the Old Head, which was then attacked in 1760 by the disgruntled sons-in-law of the late Gerald. John escaped their guns by leaping, in his nightgown, from an upper story and fled to Kinsale. The sheriff quickly put him back into possession using the threat of force. This dispute rumbled on until 1767, when John was finally accepted as the baron by the House of Lords. In 1767, the year his title was claimed, the mortgage of 1748 was transferred, by the baron's request, to Francis Carney of Garrettstown. Supporting evidence of Gerald's daughter's claim? It's hard to say at this distance of time. But anyway, the mortgage stayed with Carney's descendants and heirs until 1822, when it was demanded. In 1768, the estate was said to be bringing in £900 a year, but it was encumbered with debts of £14,000, so the new baron asked the government for an increase of his pension to £400, which was granted. In 1790, the Kinsale estate was still reckoned to be worth £1,100. As mentioned before, one of the main expenditures of the family seems to have been on the provision of dowries for daughters. To give one example, when a de Courcy daughter was married in 1821, another £1,500 was simply added to the debts charged on the estate. As mentioned earlier, The 1748 mortgage lasted until 1822, when Francis Carney's heirs demanded it. The £600 having grown to £2,470 owed. The Baron could not pay it, and it seemed like the Garrettstown estate would take over the de Courcy one. This would have unified the divided Carney estate in the area between Garrettstown and Jamesfort. However, the estate was saved by the intervention of the Baron's spinster aunt, who paid off the mortgage and the interest. The last Baron Kinsale to live in Ireland was the Reverend Thomas, 27th Baron, who died in 1832. His nephew, John Stapleton, 28th Baron, was living in Devon, where a branch of the family had moved to around 1800. The last de Courcy of the immediate family in Ireland was the rich Aunt Elizabeth, who died in Kinsale in 1838. They never returned. Whilst the family doesn't ever seem to have been deeply involved in the day-to-day management of their estates, from this point on the estate was run solely by agents such as the Reverend William Newman and Francis Beamish. During the famine, the population on the estate fell by 36%. By what means, death or leaving, I do not know. Using Griffith's valuation of the 1850s, we can estimate the rental income of the estate as £2,317. An agent's fees were normally 5% of rents collected, so his deduction would have been £116 a year, leaving them £2,201, subject to taxes, etc. This small, for landed gentry, income meant that the complicated borrowing on the estate continued throughout the mid to late 1800s. There is no need to list all these legal deeds. One new feature, starting in 1853, is the involvement of the Barons Kingsale in economic ventures. That year, he took a lease of minerals in North Antrim with a view to coal mining. In 1859, 6 years later, he was ejected from the lease. John Constantine, 29th Baron, died in 1865, and his wife Adelaide died in 1885. They had one child, Adelaide Rohesia Constance de Courcy. The Baron was obviously reading his family history, as he had a Rohesia in his ancestry in the 12th century. It is John Constantine and his wife who separated the title from the land by leaving the estate to their daughter. Lady Adelaide Rohesia married Admiral Richard Tracy in 1887. I should say that by 1876 the estate was estimated at 3,473 acres, producing £2,180 a year. The estate, run by their agents, had difficult relations with the tenants in the 1880s, with rent protests and evictions. With the passing of the Wyndham Land Purchase Act in 1903, the tenants began negotiating immediately for the purchase of their holdings. An agreement was soon reached, and the estate was sold in late 1904 for 21.5 years' purchase. That basically means that you paid 21.5 years' worth of rent as your purchase price. The Land Commission records are not accessible, but using our 1876 figure, £2,180 rental a year, we can guesstimate that the estate sold for somewhere around £47,000. This sale removed all but 2 properties of the Courcys in the area. They continued to own the Old Head Lighthouse and the ruins of the Old Head Castle until recent times. Section 4. Loyalty and Religion. The family were always loyal to the crown, although sometimes there were several crowns to choose from. Throughout their early history in Ireland, they were part of the fabric of the Anglo-Norman colony, paying subsidies to the crown, being summoned to provide men and money for the king's wars elsewhere, being appointed to positions in the government, negotiating with Irish chiefs, etc., etc. This lasted from the 1170s until the 1400s, when the de Courcys largely disappear from the records of the English establishment in Ireland. This, as I said, coincides with the ongoing retreat of English authority in Ireland, and we find the family in this period, in the 1400s, usually found in references relating to the native Irish. The 1300s to the 1500s were a period when many of the Anglo-Norman lordships were effectively abandoned by an English which was focused on its efforts elsewhere, usually France and England. And so we have the lordships interacting more with the Irish chieftains, inevitably becoming, to use the famous phrase, more Irish than the Irish themselves. Cultural assimilation of the Anglo-Normans in Ireland is one of the most interesting questions in medieval Irish history. In our case, examining the de Courcys becoming Irish is another problematic question due to the lack of source material. Would they have even defined themselves as Irish at that time? We cannot say. However, looking at the surnames of the wives of the barons possibly illuminates this aspect. The surnames of the barons' wives, such as are recorded, with one exception, were Anglo-Norman up to the late 1400s, and then we have a series of wives with Irish surnames going on about to the mid-1600s. This would seem to coincide with the decrease in influence, land, and power of the barons, and the names of these ladies correspond with some of the most influential Irish sept leaders in West Cork. Perhaps this is slight evidence of useful alliances with their Irish neighbours. The 1500s saw two major changes in Ireland: the Reformation and the reassertion of English control. The de Courcys did not turn Protestant. In those years, it was still possible to be Catholic and a friend to the English government in Ireland. This changed in the 1600s, when the Old English who did not convert lost the favour of the government. The reassertion of English control did affect the family. Gerald, 17th Baron in the 1500s, seems to have been conflicted in his loyalty. We find him, as I mentioned earlier, fighting for Henry VIII in the 1540s, albeit against the French. Yet in 1548 we find him being compelled to accept English money. The next year, in 1549, he's being described as degenerate from the English laws. By the 1560s, he seems to have been under the control, or at least the influence, of the Earl of Desmond. Whilst the Earl rebelled in the 1560s, 70s, and 80s, the Baron Kinsale managed not to follow the Earl, and so was being described as loyal to the Crown in the 1580s. As I've said earlier, John the 18th Baron supported the English at Kinsale in 61, and yet, notwithstanding this, it was proposed by the government in 1615 to send his children to England to be brought up Protestant and culturally English. The next test of loyalty came in the civil wars of the 1640s, where the family did not become involved, as I said earlier. Likewise, I talked of their exemption in the Cromwellian forfeitures of the 1650s. With the restoration of the Stuart Kings in 1660, there was more hope for a pro-Catholic establishment. Unfortunately, this attitude waxed and waned depending on the public mood in England. In one of the lulls, we find Almericus, 23rd Baron, being sent to Oxford in the 1670s. His education in England was meant to make him into three things: a Protestant, someone civilised in the English fashion, and someone friendly to the establishment. He seems to have converted to Protestantism in the 1670s whilst at Oxford. With the accession of a Catholic king in 1685, his religion changed back to Catholicism. With the victory of the Protestant William III in 1690, he changed again back to Protestantism. As to his civility, we have a series of documents surviving relating to Almericus. Indeed, he is the Baron Kingsale that most is known about, even including those of the 20th century, so he is worth looking at in some detail. We have details of his education. Sent to Christ Church College, Oxford, in 1675, his indoctrination started out well, but by 1679 they say, and I quote, "The older Lord Courcy grows, the less he esteems what is said to him." End quote. This would be when he was in his mid-teens, so we see that at least little changes in that respect. This tutor then tried to teach him French. Quote, "He gives me fair words about it, and daily puts me off from week to week." End quote. By the next year, 1680, Sir Robert Southwell, one of his guardians, writes, "I take it for granted that he is past profiting in learning what is taught there, and if he be well established in point of religion, I can, in his behalf, console myself for his want of proficiency in other studies." Bishop Fell, Bishop of Oxford, also writing in 1680, says, "As to my Lord Courcy, though I cannot boast any great acquisitions in learning, I may assure your Excellency that he has lived here with sobriety and innocence." John Percival, a relation of Southwell, also writes in 1680, "My Lord Courcy is much grown, discourseth fluently, is mightily grave and sedate, and to appearance rational and discreet. and everybody gives this character of him, but they all say he will never be a scholar, because he wants application, which he never had, and I am afraid they have not tried what miracles the mathematics would work with him." End quote. By the end of 1680, having been at Oxford for 5 years, the 18-year-old lord was keen to take his place in the world, and Bishop Fell wisely said, "When men are once weary of a university life, it ceases to be useful." Almericus could not undertake the aristocratic grand tour of Europe due to his poverty. Also, it was feared that London would corrupt him. The aristocratic circle of the king wouldn't work because it would be too expensive for him and also corrupt him. They feared a return to Kinsale would expose him to his Catholic relatives, who would quickly reconvert him. He was also not seen fit for a government or military position, but eventually a return to Ireland was decided upon, but then as quickly cancelled, and he was sent to London. Arriving in London in 1681, he quickly fights a duel with Lord Newborough. Almericus is next listed as being paid as a member of the Crown's Secret Service from 1683 to 1685. Irritatingly, it does not list what these services were. At the beginning of 1685, he was posted to Ireland in the army. By 1686, he is listed as a Catholic officer, suggesting that the accession of the Catholic King James II in 1685 had caused this reconversion, or possibly his relations had affected it, as was feared by his Protestant guardians. Another source suggested that he reconverted in 1689 as a means of advancement. In 1690, with the Protestant William of Orange winning the war in Ireland, he retired from James's army to his estate near Kinsale. With the victory of William, the Lord Kingsale reconverted to Protestantism in 1691. But, in the meantime, he was outlawed for high treason and was due to have his estates confiscated. However, by taking the oath of allegiance to William and his return to Protestantism, he was forgiven and he was allowed to keep his lands. He married an Englishwoman, Anne Dring, in 1698 and seems to have spent the rest of his life at Isleworth in England until his death in 1719. His impressive tomb can still be seen in Westminster Abbey. Almericus's cousin Gerald became the 24th Baron, the gentleman who went mad, as I mentioned earlier, and his loyalty seems to have been somewhat dubious as well. We have him in England in the 1720s, consorting with rich, known Jacobites. Yet we have him marrying into the English gentry in 1725, marrying the heiress Margaretta Essington, and she was expected to inherit £100,000. However, despite his Jacobite acquaintances, Jacobites were normally Catholic, he seems to have been Protestant, at least from his young adult days. And this would have helped his assimilation into the ruling elite. In 1725, in an interesting quote, he is described as an Irish peer, but of English extraction, and this after 548 years of the family being based in Ireland. By the 1740s, Gerald is raising troops to support the government, and there are no further signs of the de Courcys ever again erring from the establishment side. John, the 25th Baron, the man who was alleged to have been the sailor in Portsmouth, once he became Baron, he started to interact with local government in Kinsale. He sat with the corporation. He became a vestryman at St Maltose. He was firmly on the side of the establishment. And so, from the late 1700s continuing to the 1900s, the family produced an admiral, a governor of Tilbury Fort, soldiers, colonial administrators, clergy, and they continue landlords. They become a fairly typical ascendancy family and aren't really very different from most of the others. Section 5. The Hat Privilege. No discussion of the de Courcys of Kinsale would be complete without the story of their right to remain covered, i.e. keeping their hat on, in the presence of the monarch. Indeed, this irritatingly prevalent tale is often the only thing told of the family, yet even this tale is debatable. Sir John de Courcy, having conquered East Ulster, was brought down in political intrigue and imprisoned around 1203. The story goes that, in the version told by Sarah Fox, and I quote, "After his lordship had been in confinement about a year, a dispute happening to arise between King John and Philip Augustus of France concerning the Duchy of Normandy, the decision of which being referred to single combat, King John appointed the day, against which the King of France provided his champion. But the King of England, less fortunate, could find no one of his subjects willing to take up the gauntlet, until his captive in the Tower, the gallant Earl of Ulster, was prevailed upon to accept the challenge. But when everything was prepared for the contest, and the champions had entered the lists, in the presence of the monarchs of England, France, and Spain, the opponent of the Earl, seized with a sudden panic, put spurs to his horse, and fled the arena, whereupon the victory was adjudged with acclamation to the champion of England. The French king being informed, however, of the Earl's powerful strength, and wishing to witness some exhibition of it, his lordship, at the desire of King John, cleft a massive helmet in twain at a single blow. The king was so well satisfied with this signal performance that he not only restored the Earl to his estates and effects, but desired him to ask anything within his gift, and it will be granted. To which the Earl of Ulster replied, that having estates and titles enough, he desired that his successors might have the privilege to remain covered in the presence of his Majesty and all future kings of England, which request was immediately conceded. That version, end quote, that version of the tale comes from 1874. Now, despite the vaunted origins of the legend, it only emerges in the 1600s, hundreds of years after the event. Whilst it may be argued that the Courcys, being largely resident in Ireland during the Middle Ages, and the infrequent visits of the English monarch to Ireland, 1399, 1690, 1820, etc., meant that there was no opportunity for the lords to keep their hats on. The earliest mention that I can find of the privilege is in a 1708 guide to the Tower of London. In the 1500s, in the account of the 1500s of the combat, there is no mention of the privilege. In the 1627 investigation of the de Courcy titles, there is also no mention of it. I find its complete absence in the earlier records as very suspicious. Also, nearly all of the versions of the legend say that Sir John received his estates back. He didn't. The de Lacys kept them. The first unverified instance of the privilege being used is in the 1690s, and I suspect that the hat privilege is a creation of Almericus, used to emphasise the ancient importance and loyalty of his family, especially having taken the losing side in 1690. Section 6. Residences. I will finish my brief history of the family with a discussion of their residences, grounding them physically to this place. In the medieval period, they had Kilbrittain Castle, Oldhead Castle, and Ringrone Castle as their main strongholds to the west. Castle Park Castle, where James Fort is now, was one of their minor fortifications, of which there may have been several more, including an earlier version of Kilgobbin Castle as well. The standing castle at Kilgobbin was built by the McCarthys in the 1400s. Their estate east of the river is more difficult to speak of due to the lack of surviving records. With the strength of the town, the lack of a powerful enemy there, and the smaller portion of their estate being there may have been little need for forts, and so they were content with a castle in Kinsale, in Kinsale town itself. And by castle I mean a tower house, something like Desmond Castle, but only larger. It was located on the west side of Higher O'Connell Street. I am still trying to verify its exact location, but there are hints that it was at the northern end of the street, close to the old marketplace, but I am still researching this. This would be at the back of the folk house. Having mortgaged this property in the 1630s, they'd lost it by the 1660s, and the castle itself was in ruin by 1699. In the 1600s, many castles were abandoned for more comfortable homes, and the de Courcys were no different. Their old head castle is last recorded in use by them in the 1640s, when English tenants were using it for safety during the rebellion. Lord Kingsale seems to have been living beside Ballinspittle at the time. Despite their reduced comparatively circumstances from the late 1600s on, they seem to have had a major residence and a minor one, Old Head Manor House and Kilnacluna House. There is no date known for the erection of the Old Head Manor House, but it is certainly in existence by 1693, when you can see it depicted on Grenville Collins' map. and it seems to have been demolished sometime in the 1800s. The tale that I mentioned earlier of John Baron Kingsale leaping from its upper stories in 1760 suggests that it was substantial. The site of it is at Clifftop Court, close to the Speckled Door. The large walls of the domain are still by the roadside. The house at Kilnacluna seems to have been a more minor house and was in use in the 1700s. This would have stood on the height across from the Gully Bridge. After the loss of their castle in Kinsale in the 1600s, they don't seem to have had a verified residence in Kinsale, at least not one that I can find, until the late 1700s, when they rented out what is now the yacht club from the Southwell family. This was seemingly the final residence of the de Courcys in Ireland, and having traced the family, their money and their lands in the Kinsale area, I conclude this brief fragment of my researches on the family. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you enjoyed that. As I always say, I know that I have given you a huge amount of detail, but at least this time you can re-listen to it. As I said at the start, if you have any questions, then please post them up and I will attempt to answer them. I have much more information on the family if anyone is even more curious than that, and I'd happily share it with them. And as I said, and I'll end on this, if anyone does have any old documents about Kinsale, please do contact me and let me see them. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind attention.